Some stories should never be told. Some secrets should never be revealed. But tonight, I will take you into the darkest depths of human horror. What you are about to hear will challenge your understanding of reality and make you question everything you believe you know about death and life. The story I'm going to tell you took place in a small lost town called Ravenshollow, a place where nightmares come to life. Prepare to discover events so terrifying they will haunt your nights for years, because this story hides shocking revelations that will not leave you unscathed. Sarah Mitchell was an ambitious journalist of 28 who worked for a small local newspaper in Boston. Her specialty was paranormal investigations, and she had already written several articles on unexplained phenomena that had earned her some recognition. One October morning, she received a mysterious call from a trembling and desperate voice that would change her life forever. The man on the phone introduced himself as Thomas Blackwood, a resident of Ravenshollow, who claimed to have information about a series of unexplained disappearances in his town. Thomas explained to her that for 6 months, 12 people had mysteriously disappeared without leaving the slightest trace. The local police seemed completely overwhelmed by these events and refused to take things seriously. He begged Sarah to come investigate, claiming that the inhabitants of Ravenshollow lived in absolute terror. His voice broke when he mentioned that his own daughter, Emily Blackwood, age 16, was among the missing. Sarah felt her journalist instinct awaken immediately. She had always been attracted to unsolved mysteries, and this case seemed perfect for her next big investigation. Without hesitation, she agreed to go to Ravenshollow the next morning, completely unaware that she had just signed her death warrant. The journey to Ravenshollow was long and winding, the road snaking through dense and dark forests that seemed to stretch to infinity. The closer Sarah got to the town, the more oppressive and threatening the atmosphere became. The trees seemed to lean toward the road like grotesque creatures trying to grab her car. The sky, though clear at the beginning of the journey, gradually darkened until it took on a particularly disturbing lead-gray tint. When she finally arrived in Ravenshollow, Sarah was struck by the strangeness of the place. The town seemed frozen in time, with its Victorian houses with dilapidated facades and cracked cobblestone streets. There was practically no sign of life in the streets, no cars, no passers-by, just a heavy and anguishing silence. The few streetlights still functioning flickered in an erratic and threatening manner, creating terrifying shadow plays on the ground. Sarah parked her car in front of the town's only hotel, a gloomy and dilapidated building called the Raven's Rest. The facade was covered with black ivy that seemed to have invaded every square centimeter of the structure. The windows were so dirty it was impossible to see through them, and the entrance door creaked in a sinister and disturbing way with every gust of wind. Inside the hotel, the atmosphere was even more oppressive and unhealthy. The lighting was very dim, created by a few flickering bulbs that cast dancing shadows on walls covered with yellowed wallpaper. The air was charged with a musty smell mixed with something more disturbing, an organic stench that Sarah couldn't identify. The receptionist was a skeletal and pale man of about 60 who looked at her with glassy and expressionless eyes. He didn't say a word during the entire check-in process, merely pointing toward the creaking stairs that led to the rooms. Sarah noticed that his hands trembled constantly and that he regularly cast nervous glances toward the windows. Her room was located on the second floor in a dark and narrow corridor lit by a single bulb hanging from the ceiling. The carpet was worn to the threads and stained with suspicious marks of unknown origin. The walls were covered with torn wallpaper that was peeling in places, revealing disturbing moisture stains. Once in her room, Sarah tried to call Thomas Blackwood to inform him of her arrival, but her cell phone had no signal. She tried the room's landline, but the line seemed completely dead. This total isolation began to worry her, but she attributed these problems to the remote nature of the town. The first clue that something was really wrong came during the first night. Sarah was awakened around 3 in the morning by strange noises coming from the corridor. She heard slow and dragging footsteps, as if someone was walking with difficulty and pain. These noises were accompanied by a dull moan that seemed to come from the depths of the soul. Curious but cautious, Sarah got up and pressed her ear against the door to hear better. The noises seemed to be approaching her room, and she could distinguish what sounded like incomprehensible whispers. Suddenly, the noises stopped right in front of her door, and Sarah felt her heart race in her chest. She waited several minutes in absolute silence, not daring to move. Then, slowly, she turned the door handle and opened it slightly to take a look into the corridor. What she saw chilled her with horror. The corridor was completely empty, but on the carpet she could distinguish wet traces that seemed to lead toward the stairs. The next morning, Sarah decided to begin her investigation by going to the local police station. The building was as dilapidated and sinister as the rest of the town, with its cracked brick walls and barricaded windows. Inside, she met Sheriff Davidson, a corpulent man in his 50s with a face marked by alcohol. He assured her that law enforcement had the situation under control and that these alleged disappearances were just voluntary departures. According to him, the people of Ravenshollow tended to leave without warning when they had enough of small-town life. But Sarah noticed that the sheriff's hands trembled slightly when he spoke, and that he carefully avoided her gaze. She insisted on seeing the official files, but the sheriff categorically refused, citing confidentiality issues. However, she noticed an open file on his desk with the photo of a blonde young girl who resembled Thomas's description of his daughter Emily. Frustrated by the lack of cooperation from the authorities, Sarah decided to conduct her own investigation by questioning the inhabitants. But this proved to be a more difficult task than expected, as most of the houses seemed abandoned or uninhabited. The few people she encountered in the streets looked at her with mistrust and terror before quickly fleeing. Finally, she managed to find Thomas Blackwood thanks to the address he had given her over the phone. His house was an imposing Victorian mansion, but in very poor condition, with closed shutters and a garden completely overgrown with wild vegetation. When Thomas opened the door, Sarah was shocked by his appearance. He seemed to have aged 10 years since their phone conversation. Thomas invited her into a dark living room with furniture covered in white sheets. He explained that his wife had died 3 years earlier, and that since Emily's disappearance, he lived like a terrified recluse. His voice was broken with emotion when he recounted the events that had preceded his daughter's disappearance. According to Thomas, Emily was a normal teenager who loved spending time with her friends and studying for her exams. The evening of her disappearance, she had gone out with 3 of her friends for a movie night in the neighboring town. They were supposed to return around 11 o'clock, but never arrived at their destination and never made contact again. Initial searches had revealed that their car had been found abandoned on an isolated road a few kilometers from Ravenshollow. The vehicle was in perfect condition, the keys were still in the ignition, and no sign of struggle was visible. The girls' cell phones had been found in the car, but they were all completely dead. What made this disappearance even more mysterious was that the security cameras on the road had stopped working exactly when the car had passed. Thomas had personally checked the recordings and had found that the image cut abruptly for exactly 27 minutes. Dear viewers, I'm going to pause in this chilling story to ask you for a service that could save lives. If you want me to continue telling you the most terrifying and authentic stories, subscribe to this channel and activate the notification bell. Each subscription gives me the strength and courage to continue exploring these dangerous mysteries to bring them back to you. Don't forget also to check the link in the description to participate in our exclusive contests, where you can win objects related to the stories we explore. Your support is essential for this channel to continue revealing the truth about these unexplained phenomena. Now, let's return to our terrifying story, because what Thomas was about to reveal to Sarah exceeded everything she could have imagined. Thomas then took out a rusty metal box that he had hidden under his couch. Inside, there were dozens of photographs taken by the inhabitants of Ravenshollow over the past months. These images showed unexplained phenomena that had occurred in the town shortly before and after each disappearance. The first series of photos showed strange lights that appeared in the sky above the forest. These lights were not natural phenomena like northern lights, but rather perfect geometric shapes that pulsed with hypnotic intensity. Some photos showed these lights moving in formation as if they were controlled by a superior intelligence. Other images revealed unexplained modifications to the landscape around Ravenshollow. 100-year-old trees had been found completely dried out overnight, their branches twisted in impossible positions. Some photos showed perfect circles in the fields where nothing grew anymore, as if the earth itself had been poisoned or cursed. But the most troubling images showed the inhabitants themselves. Thomas had documented physical and behavioral changes in Ravenshollow residents. Some people seemed to have aged prematurely, their skin becoming gray and their hair whitening in a few weeks. Other inhabitants showed mysterious wounds that appeared during their sleep. These marks resembled geometric burns that formed complex patterns on their skin. The doctors consulted had never seen anything like it and were unable to explain the origin of these wounds. Thomas explained to Sarah that these phenomena had started exactly 6 months earlier, when a team of archaeologists had come to excavate an ancient site in the surrounding forest. This team claimed to be searching for Native American artifacts, but the inhabitants had noticed that they used very sophisticated equipment that seemed to exceed the scope of simple archaeological excavations. The team was led by a mysterious professor named Dr. Marcus Thorne, a man who categorically refused to speak to local inhabitants. Thomas had attempted several times to approach the excavation site, but it was strictly guarded by armed security agents. 3 weeks after the excavations began, the archaeology team had abruptly left Ravenshollow in the middle of the night. They had taken all their equipment and partially filled in the site they had excavated, but according to Thomas, they had left behind something much more dangerous than what they had taken. The day after their departure, the first strange phenomena had begun. The animals in the region had become aggressive and unpredictable, attacking without provocation and fleeing the forest en masse. Domestic dogs refused to go out at night and howled constantly toward the forest. Sarah listened to this account with a mixture of fascination and horror. Her journalist instinct told her that Thomas was telling the truth, but the rational part of her mind refused to accept these paranormal explanations. She decided that she had to see the excavation site for herself to understand what had really happened. Thomas warned her against this idea, explaining that no one had ventured into that part of the forest since the archaeologists' departure. Those who had tried had returned in a state of deep shock, unable to tell what they had seen. Some had completely lost the ability to speak and spent their days drawing incomprehensible symbols. Despite these warnings, Sarah was determined to continue her investigation. She asked Thomas to draw her a map to locate the excavation site, which he did reluctantly. Before leaving, he gave her a strange object that he had found near his house after Emily's disappearance. The object was a polished black stone the size of a coin, covered with microscopic engravings that seemed to move when you stared at them. Thomas explained that this stone became hot to the touch during the night and sometimes emitted a faint greenish glow. He thought this object was linked to the mysterious forces that tormented Ravenshollow. Sarah took the stone and slipped it into her pocket, ignoring the cold sensation that traveled up her arm. She thanked Thomas for his information and promised to keep him informed of her discoveries. As she left his house, she noticed that several inhabitants were watching her from their windows with expressions of terror and pity. Back at her hotel, Sarah spent the evening organizing her notes and planning her expedition into the forest. She checked her equipment: camera, flashlight, GPS, and provisions for a full day of exploration. But what she didn't know was that her movements were closely monitored by forces she couldn't imagine. That night, Sarah had the most terrifying nightmare of her life. She dreamed she was walking in an endless forest, pursued by moving shadows that whispered her name. These shadows had deformed human faces that expressed unspeakable suffering. In her dream, she realized that these faces belonged to the missing people of Ravenshollow. Emily Blackwood was among them, and she extended a pleading hand toward Sarah while murmuring incomprehensible words. The dream ended when Sarah fell into a bottomless abyss filled with these shadows that drew her toward the infernal depths. She woke with a start, drenched in sweat and her heart pounding. The stone Sarah took it out and observed it with fascination and disgust, as the engravings seemed to dance before her eyes. The next morning, despite her restless night, Sarah prepared for her expedition to the excavation site. She left the hotel at the first light of dawn, hoping to avoid the attention of the inhabitants and local authorities. The forest surrounding Ravenshollow was dense and impenetrable, with trees so close together they almost completely blocked the sunlight. Following the map drawn by Thomas, Sarah plunged into the winding paths that snaked between the massive trunks. The forest atmosphere was oppressive and unhealthy, with total silence that was only broken by the sound of her own footsteps. There was no bird song, no rustling of small animals, as if life itself had fled this cursed place. The further she progressed toward the excavation site, the more Sarah felt a strange sensation in her body. She had the impression that the air was becoming denser and more viscous, making her breathing difficult. Her muscles seemed heavy and numb, as if an invisible force was trying to slow her down. After 2 hours of walking, Sarah finally reached a clearing where signs of archaeological excavations were still visible. The ground was dug up and excavated over an area of about 50 square meters, forming complex geometric patterns. In the center of the excavated zone, there was a gaping hole about 3 meters in diameter that seemed to descend deep into the earth. Sarah cautiously approached the edge of the hole and directed her flashlight toward the depths. What she saw made her recoil in horror. The walls of the hole were covered with symbols identical to those engraved on the stone Thomas had given her. These symbols seemed to pulse with a life of their own, emitting a faint glow that made the darkness even more terrifying. More troubling still, Sarah could hear strange sounds rising from the bottom of the hole. These noises resembled human whispers mixed with scratching, as if something was trying to dig toward the surface. She realized with horror that these sounds corresponded exactly to those she had heard in her hotel corridor. Suddenly, the stone in her pocket became so hot that it burned her through the fabric of her pants. Sarah quickly took it out and was amazed to see that it was glowing intensely with that greenish glow. The engravings on the stone seemed to react to the symbols carved in the hole's walls, creating a sort of hypnotic visual resonance. That's when Sarah heard footsteps approaching the clearing. These steps were slow and dragging, exactly like those she had heard in her hotel. Panicked, she looked for a place to hide and slipped behind a massive tree. But these figures were not entirely human. Their skin was a sickly grey. Their eyes were completely white, and they moved with jerky and mechanical movements. Sarah immediately recognized one of these figures. It was Emily Blackwood, Thomas's missing daughter. But Emily was completely transformed. Her once smiling face was now empty and expressionless, and her blonde hair had become white as snow. She still wore the clothes she had on the evening of her disappearance, but they were dirty and torn. The three figures stopped at the edge of the hole and began to chant in a language Sarah didn't recognize. Their voices created a discordant harmony that seemed to make the air around them vibrate. The symbols on the hole's walls began to glow more intensely in response to this chanting. Then, something even more terrifying began to emerge from the bottom of the hole. First, Sarah saw only black tentacles that wrapped around the edges of the hole. These tentacles were covered with a viscous substance that seemed to absorb light itself. They moved with malevolent intelligence, feeling the surface as if they were looking for something. Next, a shapeless mass began to slowly hoist itself out of the hole. This creature, defying all description, was an amalgam of flesh and decomposing organic matter. It possessed several human faces that emerged and disappeared in its mass, all expressing eternal agony. Sarah realized with horror that these faces belonged to the missing people of Ravenshollow. She could see men, women, children, all integrated into the flesh of this abomination. Their mouths opened and closed silently, as if they were trying to cry for help but no longer had the capacity. The creature rose on its multiple appendages and turned its attention to the three human figures. Emily and her companions approached the creature fearlessly and extended their hands toward it. The creature enveloped their hands with its tentacles, and Sarah saw an energy exchange occur between them. The human figures began to change appearance before Sarah's horrified eyes. Their grey skin became even paler and translucent, revealing a network of black veins that pulsed beneath the surface. Their white eyes began to glow with the same light as the symbols on the hole's walls. Sarah then understood that she was witnessing a horrible transformation. These people were no longer human. They had become servants of this monstrous creature. The creature was using them to attract other victims to Ravenshollow, creating an endless cycle of disappearances and transformations. The stone in Sarah's hand was becoming hotter and hotter, and she realized it was probably a fragment of the creature itself. Thomas had found it near his house because the creature's Suddenly, Emily and her companions turned their heads in Sarah's direction with synchronized movements. Their glowing eyes fixed directly on her hiding place, and Sarah understood that they had located her. Thanks to the stone, a horrible and inhuman smile appeared on Emily's face as she began to approach the tree. Sarah knew she had to flee immediately if she wanted to have a chance of survival. She threw the cursed stone as far as possible and began to run desperately through the forest. Behind her, she heard the pursuit sounds of the three figures rapidly approaching. The race through the forest was nightmarish. Branches scratched her face, roots tried to trip her, and the darkness seemed to thicken around her. Sarah had the impression that the forest itself was conspiring to prevent her from escaping. The trees seemed to move to block her passage, and the paths she had followed to come had mysteriously disappeared. She had been running for what seemed like hours when she realized she was going in circles. She recognized certain trees she was sure she had already seen, and absolute panic began to take hold of her. Her pursuers seemed to be playing